All right, everyone, get ready for this deep dive because today we're going to be talking about something pretty intense.
Intense is right.
We're diving into the potential global impact of Trump's potential return to the White House.
Oh, yeah, second term for Trump.
A second term.
Which, honestly, I think a lot of people thought we'd never see.
I don't think anyone had that on their bingo card, right?
No.
So we've got a ton of articles here, reports, analyses, all sorts of stuff. And let me tell you, they paint a very interesting picture of what a second Trump term could look like, especially on the global stage.
It's almost like rewinding the clock back to, 2018, 2019?
Yeah.
But with even higher stakes this time around. I mean, think about it. We've got the war in Ukraine raging, tensions in the Middle East, the global economy teetering on the edge, and Trump's potential policies on immigration, foreign policy, trade. It's a lot to unpack.
Okay, so let's start unpacking then. Let's jump right into one of the most controversial topics, immigration. Trump's making some pretty big promises, specifically about deportations. He's talking about the largest deportation operation in U.S. history, which sounds ambitious to say the least.
Ambitious might be an understatement. Think about it. Half of the undocumented immigrants in the U.S. are from Mexico. To even attempt something on this scale, you'd need a massive amount of resources, manpower, not to mention the legal challenges. It's not even clear if the federal government has the capacity to do it.
So it's like he's trying to build a wall and kick everyone out at the same time.
Yeah, it's kind of mind-boggling when you think about the logistics of it all. Plus, you have to consider the potential humanitarian crisis this could create, the strain on U.S.-Mexico relations. It's a powder keg.
And let's not forget the legal battles. Remember the travel bans during his first term?
Yeah.
The court stepped in and blocked those. This kind of mass deportation would definitely face similar legal challenges, potentially tying things up for years. So is this all just talk? Is he playing to his face, or is there a chance he could actually try to do this?
It's really hard to say for sure, but even the threat of mass deportation, it creates this climate of fear and uncertainty for millions of people. It can disrupt lives, families, even if it never actually happens.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not just about the actual act of deportation, it's about the impact, the constant fear of being uprooted. Okay, so enough doom and gloom about immigration.
Right.
Let's move on to another hot topic, the war in Ukraine. Trump has said that he can end this war in a single phone call.
Yeah, he claims he can solve it all in 24 hours, which is, classic Trump, right?
Yeah.
But then you look at what some of his former security chiefs are saying, and it's a completely different story. They're suggesting continued weapons support for Ukraine, but with the condition that Ukraine starts peace talks with Russia.
So it's like on one hand, you've got Trump, the master negotiator, saying he can just pick up the phone and fix everything. And then on the other hand, you've got these seasoned military strategists advocating for a much more cautious and negotiated approach. It's like two completely different playbooks for the same game.
Right. And then you throw in the fact that Hungary's prime minister, Viktor Orban, has said that Trump wouldn't give Ukraine any financial aid at all. And it makes your head spin trying to figure out what's real and what's not.
It really is like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this war that's dragging on with no end in sight, conflicting advice, and Trump's own history of, let's just say, unconventional diplomacy. So where does that leave us? Is he going to be a peacemaker, or will he escalate the conflict even further?
It's hard to say. What's really interesting here, though, is the shift in opinion among Republican voters. More and more of them actually want to cut military aid to Ukraine.
Right.
There was this Pew Research Center poll recently that showed a huge gap between Republicans and Democrats on this issue.
So he's got this internal pressure within his own party, a war that's become a global crisis, and his own, shall we say, unique approach to foreign policy. This could go either way, a brilliant resolution or a complete disaster.
And the stakes are incredibly high. If he pulls back support for Ukraine, it could embolden Russia. It could weaken NATO, and it could completely change the balance of power in Europe.
Okay, so we've covered immigration, the war in Ukraine, which are both pretty heavy topics.
Yeah.
But wait, there's more. Let's move on to another region that's always a bit of a powder keg, the Middle East.
And always unpredictable, right?
Exactly. And Trump has repeatedly promised to bring peace to this region, specifically talking about the conflicts between Israel and Hamas in Gaza and Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Right. And he's always had a strong pro-Israel stance. Remember back in his first term, that close relationship he cultivated with Benjamin Netanyahu?
Yeah, and some of his key actions in the region, like declaring Jerusalem the capital of Israel and moving the U.S. embassy there, That really resonated with his evangelical Christian base, but it was met with a lot of disapproval from the Palestinians.
And it definitely complicated the already sensitive issue of Jerusalem's status.
And then there's his support for Jewish settlements in the West Bank, which, for our listeners who might not know, are considered illegal under international law by organizations like the UN.
So it's clear he's not afraid to take a controversial stance. And now he's calling for Israel to finish what it started against Hamas, but to do it quickly. Which, sounds a lot like a PR move, framing it as a decisive action rather than an ongoing conflict.
So we have Trump, the self-proclaimed master negotiator, entering a region where even the smallest misstep can have huge consequences. The question is, can he really bring peace to the Middle East?
Or will his unpredictable nature, which some have called a diplomatic asset, backfire in this incredibly volatile region? It's a question a lot of people are asking.
And speaking of potential backfires, we have to talk about NATO. The world's biggest military alliance, led by the US, and something that's been keeping the peace in Europe for decades. But Trump, well, he's been a pretty vocal critic of NATO.
Yeah, he's repeatedly criticized NATO, mostly because he thinks the US is paying way too much.
Right, like we're footing the bill and everyone else is getting a free ride.
Exactly. And he's even threatened, remember back in his first term, to withdraw the US from NATO completely if other members didn't step up their defense spending. That was a pretty big deal.
Huge. And just recently, he said that he would protect a country that doesn't pay. He even suggested that Russia could basically do whatever it wants in that scenario. Which is pretty shocking considering one of NATO's core principles is that an attack on one member is an attack on all. It's this idea of collective defense, which Trump seems perfectly willing to ignore.
And on his campaign website, he's actually talking about fundamentally reassessing NATO's purpose and mission. It's like he wants to rewrite the rules of the game.
So is he bluffing? Is this just a tactic to pressure other NATO members into paying more? Or is he serious about dismantling the most powerful military alliance in the world?
It's hard to tell what's bluster and what's real with Trump. But the potential consequences of his actions, they're huge. If he actually weakens or dismantles NATO, it could embolden Russia, weaken the West, and potentially even lead to another global conflict.
Okay, so we've got mass deportations, a war in Ukraine hanging in the balance, a Middle East on the brink of, well, something, and the potential dismantling of NATO. It's a lot to process, right?
Definitely.
But here's the crazy part. We haven't even touched on the economic fallout, the potential trade wars, the risk of global recession.
All things that Trump's policies could trigger. It's what makes this whole situation so fascinating and, honestly, a little terrifying. We're talking about issues that could fundamentally change the world as we know it.
And as we go deeper into all of this, I think it's important to remember that we're not just talking about some abstract political theories here. These are real-world issues with real-world consequences for people all over the planet. So buckle up, because we're about to dive even deeper into the potential global impact of a Trump presidency.
And who knows what we'll uncover along the way. And, it's not just the political and military implications of a Trump presidency we need to consider.
Right.
There's also the potential economic fallout.
Oh yeah, the economy. Trump's policies, especially when it comes to trade, they could have a huge ripple effect across the globe.
Absolutely. I mean, think about his America First rhetoric.
Right.
His focus on tariffs, protectionist policies. He's not exactly a fan of multilateral trade agreements.
Yeah.
Remember what happened with the Trans-Pacific Partnership during his first term?
Yeah, he pulled the U.S. right out of there.
Exactly. And he's made it pretty clear that he sees trade as a win-lose situation, like there can only be one winner. But the reality is global trade, it's way more complicated than that.
It's like this giant web, right?
Yeah.
Where everyone's interconnected.
Exactly. It's all about interdependence. And when you start throwing tariffs and protectionist policies into the mix, it can really disrupt those connections. You get supply chain issues, higher prices for consumers, and ultimately, it can slow down economic growth for everyone.
So what are we looking at here? Another trade war like the one he had with China?
It's definitely a possibility, and we've already seen how that impacted global markets, slowed down economic growth, created a ton of uncertainty. So yeah, a renewed focus on protectionism, especially in this current global economic climate, it could be a recipe for disaster.
So a global recession?
It's a risk for sure.
Okay.
We're already dealing with inflation, supply chain problems, and a lot of uncertainty. Adding a trade war on top of all that could really tip things over the edge.
And then there's immigration. Trump's stance on immigration, building the wall, those policies, they also have an economic impact, right?
Oh, absolutely. Immigrants play a huge role in the U.S. economy. They fill jobs, they start businesses, they contribute to economic growth. If you start restricting immigration, it can lead to labor shortages, especially in sectors like agriculture, hospitality, industries that rely on immigrant labor.
And it doesn't help with the whole aging population thing either.
Exactly. I mean, immigration, it's a complex issue with a lot of different angles, but there's no doubt that it has a significant impact on the economy. And Trump's policies in this area, they could have some pretty far-reaching consequences, not just for the U.S., but for the global workforce as a whole.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. Immigration, the war in Ukraine, NATO, the Middle East, now the global economy. It's a lot to take in, right?
It is.
It seems like a Trump presidency, round two, would be this massive shakeup, this wild ride with a lot of potential for disruption, but also maybe some unexpected outcomes. What do you think? What are some of the key takeaways from all of this?
One of the things that I keep coming back to is that we're not just talking about theories here. These are real-world issues that affect real people, millions of people around the world.
Exactly. Whether it's NATO, the war in Ukraine, the global economy, the lives of immigrants, all of these things have consequences. Real-world consequences.
And that's why I think it's so important for people to stay informed, to engage with these issues, to think critically about what's happening.
Yeah, don't just read the headlines. Do your own research, listen to different perspectives, challenge your own assumptions. Because ultimately, the choices we make, the actions we take, the conversations we have, they all have an impact.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play in shaping the future.
So we've talked about the potential impact of a second Trump term on immigration, the war in Ukraine, the Middle East, NATO, and the global economy.
A lot of big issues for sure.
But if we take a step back and look at the really big picture, what does all this mean for the global balance of power? Like, how would a Trump presidency actually change the world order?
Well, if we look back at his first term, there was definitely a shift away from multilateralism. Like, he was much more focused on bilateral deals, one-on-one negotiations, and he really prioritized those personal relationships with other leaders over traditional alliances and international institutions.
Yeah, he kind of went rogue, didn't he? Like, he was playing by his own rules.
Right, and it's hard to say how that approach would play out this time around. Will he double down on this America First agenda? Or will he maybe be a little more pragmatic, maybe try to cooperate a bit more?
Yeah, it's tough to predict. I mean, he's definitely shown he's willing to break the mold, shake things up, but he's also made some pretty surprising deals in the past.
And we can't forget about the political situation in the U.S. either. Things are so divided right now, and a Trump victory could make that even worse, which would make it even harder to address all these global challenges we've been talking about.
So what can we do? Like, as individuals, how do we even begin to navigate this kind of uncertainty? It's a bit overwhelming, to be honest.
It is, but I think the most important thing is to just stay informed. Don't just rely on headlines or social media for your information. Dig a little deeper. Seek out different perspectives. Try to challenge your own biases.
Be critical thinkers.
Exactly. And remember that we all have a role to play in this. The choices we make, the actions we take, even the conversations we have, they can all have an impact.
So to everyone listening, keep this conversation going. Keep learning, keep exploring, and keep asking the tough questions.
Because at the end of the day, the future isn't set in stone. It's something we create together.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the potential global impact of a Trump presidency. We hope you found it informative and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time, keep learning, keep thinking critically, and most importantly, stay engaged.